Hello, I'm your host, Dan Kluche, and today we're going to go through part three, deeper dive into natural gas. And for our funny of the segment, we've included the forced acronym of short heat is trouble. But of course, with so much humor, there's truth embedded and sometimes serious truth. And that is very much the case with our enormous need for heat, particularly in industrial processes, but beyond that, for generating electricity, for transportation, it's heat engines and so forth. And so when we look at industrial uses, what we end up seeing is that with this Russian sanctions, pardon me, and Europe being extremely constrained with natural gas, about a 31% reduction in their supply. According to Bloomberg, we already see roughly half of all steel, aluminum, and zinc production in the EU shuttered. And then, of course, that it will reverberate through the entire supply chain and further highlight why we call energy the master currency and the most systemic driver of inflation. Not the only driver of inflation, but a very consequential material and major one. Anyway, what we see is in efforts to reduce GHG reductions and therefore dramatically reduce energy use, we see things coming into building code that says we must dramatically reduce the amount of embodied energy in buildings. And we see that of some of the big users, steel is number one, glass is second, and concrete is third in with these materials. And those are very significant users of energy because concrete, glass, and steel are all three very heavy materials. But I find it interesting to juxtaposition this with food, because what we end up looking at is we wouldn't necessarily think that food production is anything close to the energy consumption of these building materials. But in fact, when we take oil and put it into gas equivalent, and we consider all the mining and so forth of potassium and phosphorus, we see that they're really high users as compared to those building materials. And then nitrogen fertilizer, which is largely, when we're artificially making it, dependent on natural gas in copious amounts of natural gas. We also start to see why sometimes people say that we're absolutely, with the green revolution, eating fossil fuels. And so energy literacy around these things is just so very important to understand these things. The Haber-Bosch process, which literally was so very key in the Green Revolution. They say that without synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, the Haber-Bosch process wouldn't be possible. And what we also end up seeing is that many would argue that without that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, we would have never achieved the population growth that we have. We've since 1900 always been effectively below 2 billion people in population, and how we fed the planet obviously is really key to that. So then when we look at, well, who has the most reserves, what we end up finding is that conventional or unconventional, when we combine those, Russia is just far and away the world leader in reserves of natural gases. And the United States is and has been a large player. There's other players throughout the world, but the fact is we have a heavy concentration in gas reserves, and it will often surprise people that we end up in a place where when we look at natural gas, which was started to be used in 1885, but really didn't pick up any steam till much later, we find that 90% of all the gas consumed ever has occurred since 1965, 57 years. And that, in fact, 50%, that's when really natural gas started to gain momentum, 50% has been consumed since 1991. What we also find is we hear lots of tales, stories, and so forth about shale gases. And what we had been seeing up to shale gases really being brought on stream in a large supply was that the supply of North American natural gas had been declining and remains declining, as we see for US non-shale and as we see for Alberta natural gas. And a fair bit of that drop-off was getting replaced by shale gases. And that was so very important as we had LNG being brought on, and as we continue to see LNG being brought on, and even more pressure to do so with Russian gas now largely shut off to Europe. And that was previously about 31% of the EU's natural gas supply. But when we realize how inefficient liquefied natural gas is, a lot of us would question, should we really be using it, and if so, how much, and so forth. I mean, what we need to do to chill natural gas to a liquid state is we must reduce the temperature to minus 162 degrees Celsius. And many estimates are that the gas that arrives at an LNG plant, of the gas that arrives, about 20 to 25% is used in that chilling process. In Canada, with the gas that's currently piped to British Columbia for LNG, it's equivalent to about 75% of all the electricity that the residences in BC use. Surely, if we didn't want to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, using that low-cost natural gas to attract the many manufacturing plants that are shutting down in China or want to be repatriated to, say, North America, or that are shutting down throughout the US, throughout the EU, then one would think, gee, wouldn't that be a fantastic way to diversify our economy if we have appropriate policies, as opposed to just wasting this enormous quantity of natural gas, shipping it offshore. Just shipping it offshore creates a lot of pressure in the inflation picture, because our homes, rent, mortgages, and space heating is our largest cost on average for the average Canadian. Food is second, and I just covered how natural gas and fuels are so influential in inflation in food prices. And then oil, of course, affects us directly at the pump. And the more and more that we move transportation to electricity, then we switch it over here, and amongst many, many other things we use electricity for. And so we can only expect, if we keep doing that, our prices of electricity overall have been climbing exponentially in recent years, and they will increase. But of course, electricity is only 17% of use currently, as estimated by the Canadian Gas Association. Space heating is 52% in domestic houses as well as commercial buildings. But then in these manufacturing plants, heat, natural gas is overwhelmingly what they need. And so all of that is just translating into inflation, as I say. And the current numbers out of the US say that with the increase of household utilities and groceries and shelter costs and gasoline, every household is seeing about 11,000 plus per year increase in essentials. Really a pressure cooker. And then, of course, the more that essentials require of our overall household budget, the less there is for everything else, of course, as we know. It's fascinating to me to look at statistics that are quite recent as of 2018 and see, as compared to heating a house electrically, even including hydro-driven provinces such as BC, Manitoba, and Quebec, we still end up at an average that natural gas is on average about a 2,000 per year savings, and that tells you exactly why natural gas sales and people hooking up houses to natural gas had continued unabated. Now, BC has said, and I don't remember exactly the year, but you won't be able to hook up commercial buildings and new houses to natural gas. The result of what that will be, of course, can only be speculated, but we can expect that it's going to be something like these numbers. And of course, that's just very inflationary. We covered in part 2 how closely coupled natural gas prices are, because it's 70% of cost of goods sold to electricity production. And then we highlighted that you got all these pressure points for new natural gas uses as we speak right now, not the least consequential of which is data centers and Bitcoin mining and the internet overall. You know, GE had thought about electric vehicles, and there was a tremendous number of electric buses operating in North America kind of back in the day. Did we achieve the right balance in moving away from that, or was the right choice made? I would say I don't think we achieved the right balance. The buses were a really good idea to me to be electric, and the vehicles, I'm not convinced. But now what we end up saying is we're going to reduce GHG emissions. We're just going to flip the switch and increase our electricity demand and supply. Of course, we'll meet that by merely 62% in a few short years. And I think that that is all proving out today, very much so, to be magical thinking, not nearly enough understanding in what that needs to look like. See, in the earlier slide, what I showed was the resources, with Russia being the by far largest resources in reserve. But the U.S. has been, with much smaller reserves, the largest producer. And what we're seeing with Europe is if you use up that energy supply too quickly, unnecessarily, etc., whoever is left with the reserves ends up with an enormous energy strategic advantage, or a enormous advantage with the master currency. And what we're seeing today is with Europe not purchasing Russian gas, China has jumped to purchase as much as they can. So there's a rebalancing going on, but U.S. reserves is the one that's being depleted, and worryingly so in my mind. See, what we see in Canada is just an enormous number. You look at that in recent years and you go, in a 14-year period, 78,000 new customers joining the Canadian natural gas system. And of course, our reserves are not that great, but our oil is really great if we include heavy oil. But to do SAGD processes, to melt the oil out of the tar, we've solely relied, hard pressed to rely on much else other than natural gas, because we need enormous amounts of steam to get through that process. But yet, as we've relied more on tight oils or shale oils, what we find is that very few shale oil companies, going back to 2016, lower natural gas prices than now for sure, but the average company was spending 4 times what they earned, and so they were having a great deal of trouble. XTO was amongst the most efficient, and they executed really well. Exxon bought them at a very nice premium, and so from losing money for a period of time to prove up a whole bunch of reserves and exit to Exxon made great sense. But many of these didn't have such an exit and ran into enormous problems. And those are the fracking funny numbers. I mean, we were told we were to have 100 years of low cost natural gas, and all we have to do is look at current prices to know that that's not true. And all we have to do is look at current and recent numbers, particularly from the super major gas producers, and see, even though that they've purchased the XTOs and so forth that have made sense, overall their gas production is sliding down. And so we really, with all the pressures of the different types of uses for natural gas, we really, really, really need to be a lot more literate on what's real and in managing these things. See, what we end up with, and as you see in these 2 graphics, is that year over year, shale production has been dropping. We saw this 1-year bump up here in 2021, but that was just a return of production that had been shut in during the pandemic. And even with prices moving up as much as they have, More is coming on, but not necessarily as fast as the price reaction would have some of us think. And so, this is just showing major regions where, such as Europe and Asia, that just don't have the supply that they undoubtedly want and need. And you can see that North America has a bit of surplus, quote. I don't think they have any surplus. And there's just not enough natural gas long term to go around from everything that we factually see. And it's such a recent use and such a valuable supply that we need to be very, very cognizant and careful around that. So, as this quote says, as a result of the fracking revolution, the U.S. has become the world's top liquefied natural gas exporter and has been throwing lifelines in Europe's direction. Gas producers are happy to help if it means getting a higher price for their product. However, this has obviously raised domestic natural prices, which are nearly 3 times last year's level. Very inflationary, isn't it? And then we look and say, well, with their production levels already maxed out, and I think that's true, U.S. shale industry executives are telling European leaders that an increase in LNG exports is not in the cards. There's some pressures to export more. Maybe we'll do a little bit more, somewhat more, but how long is the great question. There's lots of pressure points. There's a tanker shortage. And right this year, U.S. natural gas inventories are very low as compared to the 5-year average. And so, as I say, and as we saw in the quote, prices have bounced accordingly. And you look from as recent as 2020, and we're down at $2 a GJ, and now we're all the way up at $8 a GJ as of May. That is enormously inflationary, obviously, for all the reasons I've highlighted. And then we compound that very, very dramatically with these carbon levies, taxes. And so this is the schedule for Canada. And what we're saying is, we're going to, we added $2 to that $8 wholesale price, plus all the other delivery charges in 2021. And we're going to add another, $5.50 and then $8 as the years go by. All I can say is, wow, sure makes other technologies more important and valuable. And so we're really big fans of concentrated solar. Been around 30 years or so, very well proven in deserts in particular, and very large plants where they produce enormous amounts of steam from the sun when the sun's shining, and they take that steam and turn it into electricity. Great stuff. Encourage that. But that is not going to help many geographies of North America and not really help too much in thermal needs. But this is an example of a greenhouse, 4,200 square feet. What we have is one of these parabolic mirrors in the greenhouse. And basically, through this very particular membrane, what we end up with is it lets in more light intensity than glass, because glass is made of sand. Sand has iron in it, and therefore the glass has iron in it. It's very expensive to remove. And so what happens is the iron blocks most of the far red spectrum, which contains the infrared and microwave and so forth. And so when we use this very clear membrane, what happens is the sunlight, including all the far red, gets through, the mirror concentrates it on this black pipe, which serves much like what we've all done, particularly as kids with magnifying glasses and lit paper on fire and that kind of stuff. So in this black pipe, we're able to generate high temperature water, even steam. And so now what we can do is we can generate that by day. We can very well store hot water in insulated tanks so that we can use it by night and overcome a lot of the criticism of intermittency of solar. And in fact, what we can end up doing is literally store it for weeks at a time. Very valuable. We can still generate high temperatures in sunny climates, even when it's cold outside in these sorts of environments. And the Manitoba Hydro Building shows that by using what they call a solar tower, you can reduce your heating costs, in their case in cold Manitoba, by 50% of natural gas usage. So, basically the return water comes in, that parabolic mirror heats it right up and back out it goes. And so this literally shows the greenhouse operating in a cold, snowy day, and we're still generating heat. And what various studies have shown is that concentrated solar is the most efficient form of solar energy capture and gain. If you're wanting to produce a high level of energy production, concentrated solar isn't free, of course, but if I'm trying to produce 100 megawatts with solar PV, I'm going to need almost a million square feet or square meters, I meant to say, of space and collectors, so an even higher capital cost, whereas I'd only need 100,000 square meters for concentrated solar. Sometimes people ask what that capital investment looks like. Well, for concentrated solar, it's estimated at only about $40 per watt, where the solar PV would be about $1.50. And so these would be large plants, and so you can see the estimated of dollars in millions. And this was a study undertaken by the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology with their R&D group. And then when you look at a comparison, evacuated tube collectors, which is solar thermal, as compared to concentrated solar, well, you have a few advantages on the concentrated solar that are worth highlighting. With the evacuated tube, sometimes you have vacuum loss, and then your efficiency goes way down. You don't have any risk of that with concentrated solar. When you're outside, you got dirt and snow and glass cleaning, etc. You'll have some of that with concentrated solar, but much less because you're inside. You got about less than 25 years of life for an evacuated tube collector, where concentrated solar there's really not moving parts, and that black pipe and the mirror should pretty much last indefinitely. And then, of course, with evacuated tube, you end up with lower temperatures. And as I say, with concentrated solar, you can go right up to to steam levels. So what this is showing is, some plants that have been operating successfully for a long time in desert locations and so forth. As I say, there's lots of study to show that concentrated solar is the best solar performer. And because it can store for so long, it overcomes that solar intermittency. This, in fact, is a glass greenhouse with concentrated solar installed for oil application. And it was in Bakersfield, California. And what they were doing is generating steam, pumping that down the holes to increase the reserve pressures and viscosity. And so very, very cool. Intelligent response number 2 to us, and we covered this a little bit in an earlier segment, and we said, we really like biogas in places where the economics work, and it's kind of a gold rush because it's the latest technology to get an influx of subsidy from government programs. Always get nervous about subsidy every single time because it's a little unpredictable, doesn't last forever as a rule. But for sure, as I covered earlier, landfills and large wastewater treatment plants, which are 2 and 3 on the list in terms of where we can capture and use biogas. They're not tapped, but they're somewhat tapped. But there's an awful lot of biogas energy to tap in the agricultural sector yet. And more importantly, it can be a very important augmentation to more efficient ways of soil amendments and so forth. And that's so needed when we think about those synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So we can start to envision in our mind around it in terms of intelligent integrated system solutions. Things that say, what we should be doing is having a seed greenhouse that the seed goes to high density vertical fodder factories that feed some amount of the ration for livestock of many sorts, cattle being one. And then the manures end up in an anaerobic digester, and the soil amendments end up back out in the fields. And some of the gas might be used for combined heat and power and CO2 production, maybe even refrigeration. And so we end up with this really incredibly integrated system, and we can further augment these things with concentrated solar and so forth that just end up allowing us to much better mimic what Mother Nature always does. She doesn't know what waste is. There is no waste. And so that's very much the mission of our sponsor, AgriHub, with their regenerative farm practice. In our next segment, we'll move into a deeper dive into oil. Thanks for joining us.